I'm Bates Gill. I'm the CEO of the U.S. Studies Center at the University of Sydney. Good to see so many familiar faces and friends joining us today. Extend a special welcome to one of our board members at the U.S. Studies Center, Joe Skrinsky. Thank you, Joe, for joining us this evening as well. The U.S. Studies Center, as many of you here would know, was founded about 5 years ago with the intention of trying to raise awareness and understanding about the United States here in Australia, but also to position ourselves as a leading center for the study of the United States, not only here, but also in the region and indeed globally. The center has grown by leaps and bounds over the past 4 or 5 years to the point today where we are about 25 full-time employees. We have other arrangements and contractual relationships with some 40 additional persons who are working with us in various capacities. We're holding something like 100 events a year here in Australia as well as abroad, particularly in the United States. And we're very pleased to say that we have around 1,200 undergraduate students passing through the courses which we offer and which contribute to degrees at the undergraduate and graduate level at the University of Sydney. So I think we have made great progress in trying to meet this mandate of raising awareness and understanding about the United States here in Australia, but we have plans to grow going forward. You may know that we've recently opened a sister center based at the University of Western Australia in Perth. It's called the US Asia Center. The new CEO there, Gordon Flake, from Washington, D.C., until recently the head of the Mansfield Foundation in Washington, D.C., has taken up the role of CEO in Perth, and I think he is going to do great things on the west coast of Australia as well. We're opening up new relationships with counterparts in Asia, in Europe, and in 2014 we will open an office for the U.S. Studies Center in New York. A big part of their job is going to be overseeing and helping facilitate a very rapidly growing study and intern abroad program, which we offer through the U.S. Studies Center at the University of Sydney, which now has attracted something between 150 and 170 Australian undergraduate students per year, both from the University of Sydney and increasingly from the University of Western Australia, who go to Los Angeles, go to Washington, D.C., undertake study and intern abroad opportunities there. And we will soon be offering similar opportunities in New York City. So we see 2014 as a very, very important year of continued growth for the center to continue to meet that very important mandate which has been set for us. And I have to say I want to thank everyone in this room who have been such loyal and very helpful supporters to our work. And we'll try to continue to be offering the kinds of events like today and other chances to interact and engage across the full spectrum of issues in relation to the United States. Let me turn then to introduce our speaker for this evening. I'm very, very pleased to be able to welcome Carol Giacomo. Carol is on the editorial board of the New York Times, where she is one of the persons primarily responsible for developing and writing the paper's views and opinions, positions on foreign policy questions. Carol is a great friend. We first met, I think, something like 15 years ago when we were both working in Washington, D.C. Carol was the Reuters correspondent in Washington covering foreign policy for that wire service for more than 2 decades before she joined the New York Times in 2007. In her capacity with Reuters in Washington, D.C., she traveled something like more than 1 million miles and to more than 100 countries with 8 secretaries of state, with various other senior U.S. officials, including the U.S. president. But she's more than a journalist. I think she has a scholarly bent. She has worked as a fellow with the U.S. Institute of Peace She is a member of the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations, and she has been most recently teaching undergraduate seminars on editorial writing and on international issues at Princeton University. She's given guest lectures at a range of other academic institutions across the United States. So a person who began as a journalist working local issues, local politics in Massachusetts and in Connecticut, who's risen to a really a pinnacle, a dream job, I would say, for many journalists across the world, where she sits today on the editorial board of the New York Times. When I took up this position about a year ago, Carol was really one of the persons in my mind that I wanted to try to bring over here to Australia because of my great respect for her work and our good friendship. Well, we've managed to do it, and I'm very, very pleased that she's been able to join us. We'll be spending 2 weeks here in Australia, traveling around the country, first in Sydney, but moving on over the coming days to Tasmania, to Perth, as well as to Canberra. So we're very, very pleased that we are able to host you here, Carol, and looking forward to your remarks, where she's going to address her take on President Obama's second term foreign policy and try to answer the question, the pivot, yes, but are other challenges across the globe going to be diverting the President's attention away from this part of the world? And if yes, what does it mean? We look forward to your remarks, Carol. Thank you so much for coming.
It is a dream job that I have, I must admit, but every job I've had, I've loved. I've been so incredibly lucky in my life. Even the first job I had as a cub reporter, covering a small little town in Massachusetts, and which included the sewer commission and the night cops and all of that kind of stuff. Every bit of it I've loved, so I've been very lucky. This speech would have been much easier to write and deliver before Putin invaded Crimea. Now President Obama is embroiled in yet another foreign policy crisis, arguably the most compelling of a presidency that seems to have a new crisis at every turn. So our topic is, yes, Asia is the future, but the Middle East isn't going away. Well, apparently Europe isn't going away either as a center of gravity and a source of instability, given the extraordinarily heightened tensions involving Ukraine, Russia, the United States, and its allies. As much, maybe even more than the Asia rebalance, or pivot as it was first called, Ukraine has now become a test of Obama's leadership, and there's no doubt about it. It is eating up a lot of time, energy, and resourcefulness for Obama and his top aides. We can talk more about this later if you like. For now, I'd say that Obama seems to have a reasonably well thought out multi-dimensional strategy involving diplomacy, sanctions, military show of force in place to deal with Ukraine and with Putin. Yet there really is no guarantee that it will be successful, and it's likely to be a problem that's with us for some time to come. Mr. Obama has been wise to resist the slings and arrows of a vicious Republican opposition in the U.S. that cares more about crippling his presidency than making sound and sensible policy. I've been impressed at how many people I've met in Sydney who have a very textured and sophisticated understanding of the American political system, more than some Americans, I'd wager. So I'm sure you're well aware of how conservative Republicans have been beating up on Obama over Ukraine, asserting that Putin is more of a leader than he is, hammering at Obama's handling of the issue, yet offering no serious alternative approaches, and blaming Obama for causing Putin to act this way in the first place, which is preposterous. When you hear politicians not just criticizing the president, which is an integral freedom of any democracy, but praising an autocrat like Putin, something is very awry. There are lots of reasons to criticize Obama and his policies on various topics, but increasingly, the opposition party in the United States isn't really a constructive opposition party, but a destructive one. That's a problem for America, and it's understandable that it makes its friends and allies anxious. It makes me anxious, too. So back to Asia. I'm going to make a few observations about President Obama's Asia rebalance in general, then some brief comments about specific issues, and then if you want to get into them in more depth and questions, we can. A couple of months before Ukraine happened, I had a conversation with a very senior U.S. military commander who told me that when he got his current job, he looked forward to being one of the commanders who oversaw the rebalance to Asia. Now that will be left to the next guy, he said wistfully. I was surprised at the comment, actually. I always thought the rebalance was oversold, missold, or misunderstood, maybe all three. This never could be a revolutionary shift. The U.S. has been a major player in Asia for decades, ditto for the Middle East and Europe. America couldn't abandon any one of those regions. Its responsibilities are too wide-ranging. The change was always going to be gradual and undramatic, at least in the near term. The U.S. is becoming more energy independent. It has withdrawn from Iraq and is withdrawing from Afghanistan. But the U.S. still has an abiding interest in the Middle East, in stability in the Middle East, and whether extremists expand their hold there. For instance, my newspaper has been opposed to U.S. military action in Syria and believes that Obama has shown prudent restraint in this regard. But we do believe the administration had an obligation to try to forge a diplomatic solution in Syria to help supply the opposition with certain equipment and provide massive amounts of humanitarian aid for refugees. And who knows how long the conflict will go on. Syria remains a catastrophe that has resisted peacemaking, not least because Putin is supporting Assad and funneling weapons to him. But Obama has a huge chance to make a difference if he reaches a nuclear deal with Iran. The same is true if by some miracle the Israelis and Palestinians decide to make peace. Both of those efforts are worth the time the administration is investing in them, especially since they're being handled in a serious way and show some promise. No guarantees, but they show some promise. The United States also has important equities in South America and Africa. Nevertheless, the Asia rebalance is very important and a far-sighted initiative. What's incontrovertible is that America is a global power and needs to be able to cope with at least several priorities at once. In Asia, you all know the numbers. Since 2000, the region has become the United States' largest source of imports and the second largest export market after North America. It's the world's most populous area and the fastest growing economic zone. It is the present and the future, not least because China, as the rising power, has increasingly manifest a more assertive stance towards its neighbor. It's no small challenge for Washington to try to peacefully integrate China into the global system while also hedging against the U.S. rivalry with China, turning into a conflict rather than cooperation. Australia, being so much closer to China than the United States, obviously has a similar challenge. Many, including America, assume the worst, namely that China is the next enemy. I still don't think that's a given. More importantly, I think that those whom assume that China's dominance is so inevitable that it will crush everybody in its wake need to remember that the real world usually isn't so neat and tidy and predictable. Things happen that we don't expect. Take Ukraine. China, big as it is, with the great potential that it has, also has big problems. Maintaining growth, capable of creating more and more jobs for many, many people, massive corruption, state-owned enterprises, an indebted banking sector, environmental degradation, lax regulation, very weak rule of law. I understand why Obama canceled a few trips to the region in recent years, but has clearly undercut confidence in the U.S. role. He's now planning a trip to Japan, South Korea, Malaysia, and the Philippines in April, and he must make good on this commitment. I've heard no inkling, that he won't be making the trip. I'm just reinforcing the point that he must. It's not that Mr. Obama has neglected the region either. Secretary Kerry has been here at least 5 times. Defense Secretary Hagel has made a number of trips as well, and Vice President Biden was in the region in December. Having said that, it does concern me somewhat that not just somewhat, it does concern me that a top-level political appointee in the administration has not taken ownership of Asia policy and the rebalance in the same way that Tom Donilon did when he was the National Security Advisor. His replacement, Susan Rice, is a smart, capable woman, but Asia is not her expertise, and despite giving a speech on Asia recently, I haven't discerned that to be one of her particular priorities. So that's a weakness in the system. A lot of the public focus on the rebalance policy has been the military aspects, which also includes the rotational deployment of Marines in Darwin and ships in Singapore. The Pentagon, in its new strategic document issued last week, asserted that its priorities continue to include rebalancing to the Asia-Pacific to preserve peace and stability. The document added that by 2020, this is reinforcing the position of the administration, 60% of U.S. naval assets will be stationed in the Pacific, including enhancements to the critical naval presence in Japan. I know a lot of people in the region have asked and are asking, is this really possible at a time when Congress is ruthless about cutting budgets and American defense spending is also being reined in? Last week, a senior defense official raised doubts in public testimony on the Hill about whether the rebalance can be accomplished within the context of the flat military budget proposed for 2015. But it was unclear to me if this off-message remark reflects a genuine concern or is just part and parcel of sort of normal Washington politics and the Pentagon's normal insistence that it never has enough money, despite basically being given a blank check during a decade at war. The official later tempered her remarks, obviously because it was embarrassing to the administration. But I think it's important to be realistic here. Just because the United States is talking about reduced defense spending, the effect for the moment is on flattening spending, reducing the rate of growth, and not dismantling America's huge military infrastructure. Even with billions of dollars in reductions, the Pentagon budget is still the largest defense budget in the world. More than, total American spending is more than the next half dozen or so countries combined. If the sequester cuts that Congress mitigated this year are allowed to go into effect next year, however, the impact could be more severe. Of course, it is essential that the rebalance be broader and deeper than just military cooperation. To that end, the United States has become more active in regional multinational multilateral institutions like the East Asia Summit in an effort to strengthen them. There's more of an effort to cooperate on climate change and to be helpful during humanitarian emergencies, such as the typhoon in the Philippines and the Indonesia hurricane. And the United States has sent a team to help Malaysia figure out what happened to the missing jetliner. Enhanced trade cooperation is also essential, both because it enables states, companies, and ordinary people to grow, prosper, and make money, but also because it acts as another geopolitical bonding agent to keep allies and partners united and heading in a common direction. Senior administration officials remain upbeat about the prospects of completing negotiations on the TPP trade deal this year. But as you know, in addition to differences over issues with other countries, there are problems even within Obama's own Democratic Party with this agreement. So we'll see how that goes. I'm not a trade specialist, so you won't get too much insight on this from me, but impediments to a deal this year still seem significant. Obviously, Mr. Obama's meetings with President Abe in about 6 weeks will be an important barometer of how discussions are going on the trade issue and many others. The United States needs to remind China that it is welcome to join the TPP when and if it can accept rules and meet the criteria. Since that may take some time, Washington could demonstrate support for the Chinese president's economic reform efforts by completing a U.S.-China bilateral investment treaty in the next few years. So apart from all that, what other major currents are shaping the regions and are on my radar scope. Like many of you, I'm deeply worried about China's growing assertiveness over regional territorial disputes. Foreign Minister Wang Li used some alarming rhetoric the other day when he said, quote, "There is no room for compromise," unquote, with Japan in the East China Sea, and China would, quote, "never accept unreasonable demands from smaller countries," close quotes, an apparent reference to the disputes with Southeastern Asian nations. It's hard to square China's insistence that it is committed to regional peace with that kind of talk, or with its increasingly aggressive actions on the seas towards these countries on a daily basis. It's also hard to square this with President Xi's comments to President Obama about wanting to chart a new kind of relationship between major powers. China's rising military budget, up 12.2% for 2015, for instance, isn't necessarily a worry in itself. China is the world's second largest economy, and it is reasonable to expect a country like that would increase military spending over time to protect its interests. The problem is that this growth is occurring at a time when China is, becoming more muscular, shall we say, about its role in the region. Beijing could ameliorate or a lot of these concerns if it demonstrated a commitment to peacefully resolve disputes with other claimant countries, be more open about where all of the defense billions are going, and developed a more cooperative military-to-military relationship with the United States. Japan, another issue, is Japan, with its rising nationalism and its attempts to revisit, if not rewrite, wartime history, also shares blames for rising tensions, heightened tensions in the region. Prime Minister Abe's behavior in visiting the shrine and announcing plans for a review of the World War II comfort women apology policy significantly risks weakening the alliance with the United States and, more broadly, efforts to project stability in the region. It was a relief, frankly, when a Japanese spokesman announced on Monday that the Tokyo government will not, apparently, after all, revise the Kono statement. But one has to wonder why the government apparently plans to continue the review, albeit in secret. All countries have war histories. The challenge is to acknowledge those histories in an honest and authentic way, learn lessons from the experience, use them to inform and improve the future. I tend to agree with those who think it is time for the United States to be more active in trying to smooth differences between Japan and South Korea. Another concern is what appears to be increasingly frequent reports from Tokyo about Japan's fears that it can't rely on American security guarantees. I can't imagine an instance where if Japan were seriously threatened, that the United States wouldn't be there to fulfill its alliance commitments. But it's perfectly reasonable and necessary for Washington to caution Japan against provoking an unnecessary fight with China over the Senkaku and Diaoyu Islands. That could be a very dangerous disconnect. Japanese and U.S. officials are meeting in Hawaii this week to review their bilateral defense guidelines for the first time in 17 years. Tokyo apparently is pushing the United States to clarify what their respective roles would be in a so-called gray zone incident. I understand there is some debate over how specific this should be, but it seems logical to try and work out a suitable understanding and at least a broad operational framework. The administration continues to assert that it remains neutral on claims in the South China Sea and the East China Sea themselves, but recently has clarified a couple of important points. In the last few weeks, the United States declared for the first time that it considered the 9-dash line that China has used to assert claims over the South China Sea a violation of international law, and that law, rather than historical rights, should be the basis for settling claims. The administration also took the right path when a couple of months ago it refused to accept China's declaration of the ADZ. Washington needs to spend more time trying to foster not only a code of conduct that would enable these countries, disputant countries, to manage their differences, but also to try to help ASEAN move forward on a resolution of the claims. Finally, I'd mention North Korea as another regional flashpoint. It's useful that the North Koreans and the South Koreans recently followed through on their interest and more than an interest, a real need to enable families who've been separated for so many years to have reunions. But the chances for a nuclear deal seem as bleak as ever. The United States needs to look for more opportunities for dialogue with North Korea. At a minimum, it should be keep talking to regional players about what their relative roles would be if North Korea ever implodes. I think that in such a case, preparation really would be essential. So with that, I think we should have a conversation.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks, Carol. Thanks very much, Carol, for those remarks. I think you've whetted all of our appetites to talk a little bit more about the rebalance and, of course, all the challenges that it faces, not just within the region, but in terms of resources that need to be deployed elsewhere, whether they be diplomatic or military in other parts of the world, which will inevitably draw away attention, I suppose, and focus from what remains, comparatively speaking, a relatively peaceful and prosperous part of the world here. But I wanted to get your comments just looking ahead a little bit. I mean, it's often, we're going to be coming into the last 2 years of the Obama presidency. He, depending on how the midterm elections go in November, he may well have an entirely opposed Congress if the Republicans are successful in gaining control of the Senate. But in any event, it's going to be close. It'll probably be more of the same, basically. In other words, seemingly little likelihood of much progress in terms of domestic legislation, domestic reforms, or any sort of signature Obama domestic initiatives, save perhaps for hopefully some consolidation that he would want to see in terms of his signature domestic legislation on affordable health care. So does that mean he's going to look to the foreign policy agenda as a place where he can hopefully create some sort of lasting legacy for his presidency?
Just to clarify what you just said, though, what do you think he's going to do with health care?
Just try to solidify it and make sure that it doesn't get...
and not try to adjust it somehow through Congress?
No, I don't think so. But
that's not possible.
I think he's going to somehow try to just hang on to it and make sure it works.
Yeah.
And gains greater strength. I mean, like a lot of other entitlement programs, once it gets going and a significant portion of the population begins to see its benefits, then it'll be almost impossible to roll back.
Right. Well, it's been impossible to roll back so far because the House has voted 50 times to overturn it, and 50 times they failed. So you sort of, they don't really learn. That's not the point. Isn't to learn. The point is to make a political point, and they keep making that political point.
Exactly.
I think the last vote was number 5-0. Right.
So, I mean, if I'm correct, that it's unlikely he'll see much in the way of significant domestic reforms or change or new initiatives going forward, that leaves the foreign policy agenda for him.
Right.
Do you see that as a place where he would want to try to be even more proactive than he's been so far? And if so, where and how and what looks promising? on that agenda?
The two biggest, the two things that look most promising are Iran and the Arab-Israeli conflict. The negotiation, they got an interim deal last year. They're working now on and by they, I mean the P5+1 in Iran, are working on negotiations toward a final nuclear agreement. The Iranians are very committed to trying to get relief from sanctions and seem to be willing to, at least if you listen to the rhetoric, they seem to be willing to make trade-offs in order to get there. The negotiations are very promising, but it's not guaranteed. But I think that there's a great reason on both sides to work really hard to try to make this happen, and that would be a huge, important, gain. Not gain. Gain isn't the right word, but achievement for Obama if he's able to pull that off. And the same thing with if he's able to bring the Israelis and the Palestinians into some sort of a peace agreement. They've been pursuing that very seriously. The fact that, to a great extent, both sides have been rather quiet about the nature, the details of the negotiations, that usually is a good sign that people are at least taking the process seriously. The Americans are supposed to be putting out soon, by the end of April, if not before, a framework, a set of principles that would serve as the framework for final negotiations, negotiations on a final deal. So there's a decision point coming for Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Abbas as to whether they'll, accept this framework as a means of moving forward. And again, this is a crisis, a conflict that's been unresolved for many, many years, and a lot of people are betting that it'll never come to closure, but I try to be positive about it.
Are you hearing a scratching out there? I think it's your hair on the microphone.
Oh, it is?
I think so.
I'm sorry.
There we go.
Sorry.
It's just going...
I'm not very good with technology.
That's right. So both of those issues obviously get us back to the Middle East. How does that square then with the idea of refocusing American attention to the Asia-Pacific region?
Well, I mean, right now, both of those processes are in their tracks. And Obama obviously pays attention to it, but he's got people who are following them and are doing the actual negotiations. So it's not like he has to invest all that much in each process himself so far, although now that they are getting closer to a crunch point on the Arab-Israeli process, the president saw Prime Minister Netanyahu in Washington last week. He's going to see President Abbas in Washington on March 17th. So he is beginning to invest more of his political capital in that. And if they ever get to a real deal, he's going to have to up the ante. But that's not going to be for a while. So that sort of goes to your point that it's something that he could, turn his focus to in the last 2 years of his presidency. But to go back to Asia, I believe that he believes, for everything he said, and I've heard him say, or other people around him have said, he is committed to that. And it makes sense. I mean, Asia is just too important to ignore. But I think we'll see more of how he intends to handle that himself when he's out here. Well,
thanks. Why don't we see if we could take a few questions or points or issues from the floor. If you wouldn't mind just letting Carol know who you are as well, and then we'll go ahead. This gentleman here and gentleman here. And
thank you. Chris Skinner. Chris Skinner. I sometimes think that the rebalance has an inherent contradiction, but I may be wrong. But in particular, there are things happening beyond what you've mentioned, and I wondered if you'd care to comment. You said that the US is becoming more independent on energy. China, on the other hand, is becoming much more dependent on imported energy,
Right.
particularly from the Middle East.
Right.
Meanwhile, India is asserting itself, and the pipeline or the shipping routes from the Middle East to China go right past India, and India thinks the Indian Ocean is its own domain. How do you see those factors being taken into account by President Obama?
Well, I mean, the United States has made a serious effort to build a strong relationship with India, both diplomatically and militarily, mill-to-mill relationship. The nuclear agreement that was signed, I forget when it was, a number of years ago now, and was supposed to transform that relationship, I think never really sort of accomplished what the people who supported it promoted it as. But nevertheless, the United States has developed closer ties with India. And so, I mean, are you suggesting there would be conflict between the United States and the Indian Ocean?
No, but the US might need to play an active role there in the event of conflict between other parties.
Between India and... I mean, the United States doesn't have a treaty alliance with India, so it doesn't have an automatic commitment to come to its defense. But I think, and I mean, they certainly are working on cooperation in terms of keeping the sea lanes open. That's a big interest of, and has been for a very long time, between the United States and every other country who's responsible. So that would be one area where they cooperate.
Sir?
They're doing military exercises too.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Brandon Peach. You made the point that China is becoming the world's second largest economy, and as a reflection of that, it's increased its military budget.
Yeah.
The United States, obviously, as you know, not a direct democracy. The military budget in the United States occupies a substantial part of their overall fiscal ability. With an aging population in America, and as a democracy, do you expect that population will demand more of the budget be spent on long-term older persons' health care, and that will perhaps compromise America's ability to maintain a substantial military budget? And if that is the case, do you think America will have to rely more on alliances with its partners in Western Europe and Australia, and perhaps less unilaterally in any military engagements? And I should obviously point out that China does not have the impediment of being a democracy, and therefore pursue the agenda at the hierarchy desires, whereas America is perhaps compromised, having to respond to what the popular people want.
There's a lot in that question.
So I
Okay, let me try to break it down. Okay, first of all, even within the defense budget, the problem of healthcare costs, personnel costs, is creating a problem. I mean, the commanders, the defense officials are talking about it all the time, that unless there are adjustments made to the, whether it's pensions, healthcare, co-pays, all that sort of stuff, that part of the defense budget is going to eat up everything else, and there won't be any. I mean, they've got these phenomenal figures that suggest within 10, 15 years, there won't be any money for anything else except personnel-related costs. So that's a problem within the budget, the defense budget itself. And the problem is that, you can make a cogent argument for that, but there are many interest groups, veterans groups in the country who are very much opposed to any modification whatsoever. So that's a problem. Somehow they're going to have to make the argument in a compelling way to veterans groups to get them on board for even minor adjustments in the programs. The larger issue of America's Social Security system, healthcare costs, I mean, that's been a front burner issue for a long time. It's one reason why we have Obamacare. And people constantly talk about Social Security and the need for reform. That's not my area of expertise, but obviously something is going to have to be done with it. I don't have an easy answer. A lot of it is American politics, which are dysfunctional in many instances today, and that's unfortunate. So, and that's the great burden of a democracy. but no, I know, but I'm not going to endorse, autocratic, dictatorial systems. We're going to have to slog through it somehow, and hopefully there'll be changes in politics that voters will finally say enough is enough. I mean, the Republican Party itself is so divided today. They will probably keep the House. They may even get the Senate in the next election, but can they elect a president in the near future? I don't know. They can't.
Just a finer point on that, I think most predictions now suggest that within the coming 5 years or so, about 20% of the Pentagon budget will be consumed with health care, retirement benefits, long-term disability care for 10 years of war in the Southwest Asia. So that's going to be a bigger and bigger proportion there. But I don't think the American demographic picture is quite as dire as most people. I mean, comparatively speaking, the American demographic picture is pretty good. It's actually in some ways even better than the Chinese, certainly better than European and Russian picture. But you raise very good points. There was a gentleman there in the back who's been patiently waiting. Anyone from this side of the room, or am I just not noticing anyone?
How about any women?
Hi, Carol.
Indeed.
Itai Feldman. It's great to hear that we're going to make peace with Iran and that the Arabs and the Israelis are going to make peace.
I didn't say it was definitely going to happen. I would love it to happen, but there is a long road between here and there.
It's very nice. The facts on the ground say different. They're supporting Assad. They're sending ships to the Palestinians with weapons. What do the leaders in the U.S. say when they hear that?
Iran arming Assad.
Yeah.
Oh,
Sending ships.
No. I mean, people people don't like that. People think that's a bad thing. But I mean, right now, and that issue is raised. I mean, American politicians are not shy about telling Iran that a lot of the things that it does are unacceptable. And they keep sanctioning Iran companies and individuals who engage in weapons proliferation. These are existing sanctions that the Americans have on Iran. But right now, the negotiations are on the nuclear deal. And if an agreement can be made on the nuclear deal, I think, Iranian officials have told me, American officials think as well, that perhaps then the two countries can start to address other issues in a serious way. But the nuclear deal is the first nut which they have to crack. And I'll tell you, from my point of view, it's better to start someplace. That's the issue that is most threatening to the region, and if they can get a deal, then we've got to go for it and try to move forward from there.
We're trying to make an Arab-Israeli peace process start, and they're sending weapons. Is that a show? Is that what Obama wants to see?
No, of course he doesn't want to see that.
Like, how do you negotiate with them?
How do you negotiate with Iran about that particular issue?
I mean, it's not a show of good faith.
I'm not defending it. You cannot tackle every problem all at once. I mean, sometimes you can tackle multiple problems at once, but sometimes you can only sort of focus on the core issue, or else you don't get anything. And so, I mean, the Americans make it clear that they don't think that's a good thing for Iran to be doing. But I mean, what are you suggesting, that the nuclear negotiations get called off because Iran is doing lots of other things that people don't think are productive? The Iranian system is also very complicated. Rouhani got elected president and has been given a chance by the hardliners, by the supreme leader, to try to get a deal with the United States. The argument is that if he's able to make something happen, that will enhance his ability, his political capital, to try to move into other areas. We'll see.
I'll just remind everyone that at the height of the Cold War, when it was the existential goal of the Soviet Union to destroy, its arch enemy, the United States,
Very true.
we sat down and negotiated a lot of very important things.
We certainly did.
And you could even suggest, you could make the argument that some of those negotiations were actually a part of what actually led to its collapse, the Soviet Union's collapse, that is to say. I see a person in the back. Yes, please. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Danielle Merritt. You mentioned the TPP. Not a lot is known about the TPP. I was wondering if you could expand on that, what it meant for Australia and our trade, and also what are some of the points of contention in the Democrats back in the US?
I am happy to answer any question, but I'm going to tell you when I'm not an expert, okay? So the nuances, the nitty-gritty of trade negotiations is really not my forte. But in terms of the Democrats and what their problem is, apart from any, apart from the actual details of what might be negotiated, they're concerned mostly at the moment with this fast-track authority, which many of the countries who are involved in the TPP really feel that the United States must get the administration must get this authority from Congress so that a deal can be completed. And the fast-track authority basically would allow Congress to have an up or down vote on a trade agreement without amendments, if I understand it correctly. It would speed the process, and otherwise, opponents of the deal could bog it down in the legislative process, just like forever, as some senators have proven that they can do really well. So, and the Democrats are concerned. Some Democrats, not all Democrats, are concerned that the ultimate agreement, will not have enough protections for either environmental issues that are of concern to them or labor rights, things like that. So it's kind of a two-for thing. The administration is negotiating with the partners, the TPP partners, and it's also having to sort of contend with Congress.
Sir?
How do you do, Alistair? Well, as a journalist and someone who's interested in foreign affairs, I wanted to ask you how you think the NSA and Snowden issue has played out. It seems to keep on going, have a lot of life, and it's affected Obama's relationships with presidents, and both in Asia and, of course, Germany. And it's also affected maybe some of his, the feelings among some Obama supporters about his response to the issue as well. How do you think it's played out? How do you think it's going to keep on playing?
Well, as you say, it seems to go on and on and on with new revelations. I mean, Glenn Greenwald and his partners, who, especially him, who have been the custodians of this information, seem to have been very good about sort of mining it and putting it out bit by bit. But as a newspaper, as an editorial page, my paper has been very critical of the Obama administration and NSA for overstepping its bounds and, verging on unconstitutional means. And, more than just us, though, I mean, 2 federal judges have faulted, in different judgments, have faulted the NSA for overstepping its bounds, and a panel that was appointed by Obama to look into this whole issue has also been very critical and called for an overhaul of NSA. And as an editorial page, we have spoken out very strongly about Snowden and the fact that despite the fact that he technically may have violated some laws, he has produced a lot of information that we would not otherwise know, and it's been valuable information. And we've urged the president to consider, giving him some sort of clemency or some sort of plea bargain that would, lessen his sentence in some way. So he'd pay a price, but he wouldn't be in prison for the rest of his life. But it's a big issue in the United States, and my boss, who's editorial page editor, Andy Rosenthal, is a real strong civil liberties guy, and he's written very powerfully about it.
Does anyone really know, or does anyone have any idea of how much more information is still out there? What other further revelations may well be in store, or we just don't know?
Don't know. Surprise us.
Mm.
Yeah.
They can empower it by giving it bits and pieces.
Yes.
You don't know how long the string is.
Absolutely,
right.
absolutely. But you're right. It's really upset a lot of relations, and it's. Look, governments spy on each other all the time. This is not a new phenomenon, but it is a little creepy when you find out they've been listening to your cell phone, and particularly. I'm thinking of Merkel. We apparently listened in on her cell phone conversations, and when she is an ally, and for Americans, the idea that in lots of ways the NSA has captured data, from Americans. I mean, they make this point that it's just megadata and metadata or whatever it is, and they don't really know what people are saying, and the context of the actual contents of the conversation. But I find it extremely alarming.
Any other questions people like to raise at this point? I just wanted to get back, if I could, a little bit to the region again. The rebalance, I think, as you've noted, was probably overstated, overhyped to begin with, and that we now seem to be resettling into a different kind of phase where some of its sort of concrete ideas and the areas of implementation we can see are actually unfolding, but maybe the administration seems to be taking a less vocal approach, or maybe have learned some lessons from overplaying it to begin with, and are taking a more sort of tactful, lessening expectations, I guess, in a way, or at least not overplaying expectations? Or is that just an overly generous interpretation? Are we really in some trouble here in the way that it's being handled, both in terms of personalities and individuals who we're not seeing stepping up, but even in terms of funding?
I think they'd say no. Especially when Kerry was just out here. Biden was there. It was in December, I think it was. He was in Japan anyway. If you listen to recent testimony on the Hill, they seem to be, just chugging along. But from a presidential standpoint, we haven't heard anything from Obama personally on this issue in an sort of arching way for some time. And so, I can't emphasize the importance of the trip enough as to try to get a feel for where he sees this going and where it is at this moment.
Yeah, there'll be an enormous amount of attention paid to it for a week or so as he comes to the region. And of course, the President will be coming back to the region at the end of the year, including to Australia, for the G20. So there'll be a lot of attention, I suppose, devoted to it this year. And as you say, maybe we'll see some things coming
And
out.
I don't think you should, I mean, I don't know whether people think everybody, the Americans, should always be talking on a daily basis about, you know, Asia rebalance inside of a broad context. I mean, you know, people are sort of going about component parts of this day to day. Different people are going about different components day to day. And I think Odierno, who's the Army Chief of Staff, was recently in China, so he's out there trying to work with, you know, get a military, our army-to-army relationship going, which seems to be going a little bit better, but it's not, you know, it hasn't been, it's been a tough slog. And same thing with, I mean, Danny Russell, who's the Assistant Secretary of State, who handles East Asia, was on the Hill this last week, I guess it was, and he made that statement about the 9-dash line, which was the first time the United States had publicly spoken on that in such a definitive way. So they're trying to set markers, and all of that is part of, you know, creating a policy, implementing a policy for the region.
I don't know if it's a very fair barometer, Carol, but just curious. In your councils with the editorial board of the New York Times, is there any sort of a understood division as to how much attention the board needs to pay in their daily pronouncements toward domestic versus foreign policy issues? Or, I mean, is that a useful barometer to try and gauge at least what American elites wish to read?
You mean how many editorials we write about Asia?
Or just about foreign policy?
Oh, no, it's not that. It's not that precise. I mean, as an editorial board, there are about 15 members of the editorial board, and we meet 3 days a week. And everybody has a different expertise, and at every meeting, we'll go around the board, and people will talk about the issues in their area on that given day, or what they see coming up, or what's happened in the past, and we need to push it forward. And so it really has to do with each individual board member, and what they see as important, what's happening in the world. I mean, if events are happening, we try to weigh in and be part of the debate. So, and in terms of the kinds of pieces we run, I mean, we try to run a mix on the page on any given day. We wouldn't run all three foreign policy editorials. We'll run, something on the minimum wage, something on, China's military budget, which I think appeared in Monday's paper, something on prison reform. So it's a mix.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
That's you.
Oh, there we go.
Chris Skinner, thanks for a second question. Cyber world and the internet, how do you see that relating to foreign policy, particularly when you see what is happening in the Asia area in terms of control of access,
Right.
Downloading, pirating, intellectual property, and so on and so forth?
Right. Well, it's a big component, and it's growing bigger. And the Pentagon is investing a lot more money in cyber. At a time when it's, for instance, drawing down the number of Army troops. It's putting a lot of money in cyber and cyber warfare. I mean, relations with China have been, I don't want to say transformed, but they certainly have been affected in a big way by what has been revealed to be a very active Chinese, cyber penetration into American businesses and also government computers. But everybody's doing it, it seems. It's a question of, and I know at one point, certainly we had recommended, and a lot of other people had recommended, that the two governments, China and the United States, get together to sort of talk about the war part of it. You know, what do you do if you feel like somebody is using cyber techniques as an instrument of war? And so we felt, and a lot of experts felt, that the two governments, it would be wise if they got together and sort of laid out some rules of the road. I actually don't know how far along, if that ever got off the ground. I know there was some talk out of the Sunnyland Summit about creating a group to look into that, and I don't really know what happened. But it's not just, it's not just China. It's a lot of other countries as well. So it's as I say, you can tell what's important often by how much money is spent on it. And the United States has pumped up its cyber budget exponentially.
The differentiation that the U.S. government is trying to make with the Chinese is that while it's fully understood that we are spying on each other using cyber means as needed to do so, the U.S. claims that as a matter of government policy, our electronic and other cyber surveillance agencies are not trying to steal the company secrets of
Right.
of foreign companies.
Right.
That's the claim.
Right.
I assume that's probably right. Whereas the argument goes, the Chinese are doing that as a matter of government policy,
Right.
and that shouldn't be done. I don't know how they're going to possibly sort all that out, but that's at least the effort underway on the part of the United States in its deliberations with China to try and bring a stop to that type of activity. I'm not sure how successful it can actually be. We might have time for just one more question or point anyone wishes to raise. This gentleman had his hand up first, I think, and we can take another, I think, if we have the time. Females being very reticent.
Yeah.
Tom Kraus.
Hi.
One of the disappointing things for many Americans who voted for Barack Obama, and I'm one of them, I did it twice, and was his promise, reneging on his promise, along with the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Patrick Leahy, to close down Guantanamo.
Yeah.
How has that played out in America, and do the members of the editorial board ever bring that up at a conference and say, when is he going to close it down? Is there any, there's something he should do before he leaves office.
Right. We've criticized him a lot for not fulfilling that promise. But he got hung up with Congress because they barred him from bringing any prisoners who needed to come to the United States, from bringing them to the United States. And I honestly I haven't heard anything lately about any real change in that. I know that there's a trial on, they just started a trial in New York, I think, on, I want to say it was a guy he was Osama bin Laden's son-in-law. At any rate, he's being tried in a court, and as opposed to being, at Guantanamo. And so a lot is being people are really looking at the outcome of this judicial process to see whether or not it will satisfy people who think that these guys who were captured during the war years should be tried in civilian courts. So, and whether, I don't know whether Obama can end up fulfilling that promise or not, but we also have been critical.
We have just time for one more brief question, and we'll probably have to wrap up. Sir. And wait for the microphone so that we can... No, I'm sorry, I was pointing out this gentleman here. Sorry about that.
Thanks, Graham Brophy.
Hi.
Perhaps a guess or prediction before a question. If America is expected to continue to be the world's policeman and has the resources to take on that role, I can't see the Asian region really floating to the top of the in tray. But if it does, is America's interest in Asia, is it purely to sort of check up on China, or is there a genuine interest in countries like Indonesia?
Oh my gosh! I mean, I don't think it's. The United States has been involved in Asia for centuries, decades, and the interest has always been larger than China. I mean, it's commerce, it's freedom of the seas, it's helping countries like Japan and South Korea stabilize after the war and prosper. So I mean, China as a real competitor to the United States, it's relatively recent. To me, I mean, I know that was a genuine question, but I find it, and I know other people in the region have that question, but to me it just seems sensible and part of American tradition to be involved here for all sorts of reasons, and not just for China.
Well, thanks very much. There'll be more time if you would like to engage with Carol. We're going to retire from here, and there'll be a drinks reception following. Others who haven't had a chance to introduce themselves or raise any questions with Carol, you'll have an opportunity to do so then. It remains then, I think, for me simply to thank all of you for coming tonight. Thanks for taking part in what I think was a wide-ranging and interesting discussion about the many, many challenges for the President's second term foreign policy and what it might mean for all of us here in the Asia-Pacific region. I want to thank you very much, Carol Giacomo,
Sure. Thank you.
for enlightening us this evening.
Thanks.